One of the most exciting aspects of writing and even reading fiction is the world in which the characters live. Is it a world where a found family of street racing criminals turned muscle cars for hire have a penchant for routinely violating the laws of physics and most first world nations? Is it a world where a slew of ghosts ravage Manhattan in a cataclysmic harbinger of the arrival of a Sumerian demigod of destruction? Or is it a world where a globe-trotting archaeologist grubs and grimaces from one mystical adventure against the Nazis to another because it's not the years, it's the mileage? We're looking at how to take familiar elements and transform them into imaginative new experiences. I'm your host, Garrett K. Jones, and we are finishing our Season 5 deep dive into exploring elements of world building. Welcome back to The Right Way, where we have a great episode in store for you with this week's content. But before we jump into it, there's just one last episode for Season 5 coming up next week. Now, I'm really excited to close out this season with something special, so be on the lookout for that announcement. Secondly, if you are a previously interviewed author, I would love for you to come back either to guest host a top 10 reading rec video in Season 6, or if you have something new to share in your bibliography, I would love to have you return for another author awareness interview. If you're completely new as an author looking to get some promotion and some publicity, you're more than welcome to be a part of the author awareness interviews on the show as well. Follow the links down below in the video description for the appropriate sign up, and I will get you scheduled as quickly as I can. Now, let's get to world building. As I've said before, world building is one of the most crucial aspects of writing. We are going to continue looking at Ellen Brock's world building Bible template and applying it through the lens of Avatar: The Last Airbender. So far, we have examined what the Avatar's world looks like by exploring the natural world, locations, travel, architecture and infrastructure, medicine, professions, economy, history, clothing, food, entertainment, law, politics, magic, technology, religion, family, education, and language. This month, we are closing out our world building series by exploring the last two categories from the 21 that Brock listed. Today, we are covering races and species and weather. I know, vastly different, but let's dive in, shall we? Like I did in May, I'm actually going to tackle these in reverse order, starting with weather. This seems like a category that should have been included in the very first video in this series, when I talked about building up the natural world. And while weather is technically intrinsic to the natural world and how it operates, it's kind of a separate element altogether. Weather isn't affected by local flora and fauna of the world. While climate can be affected by people in both large and small scales, it's really not going to stir up an F5 tornado in an area that never experiences them because a bear shits in the woods. In Brock's World Building Bible, she gives us 5 bullet points to focus on. There's typical and atypical weather. There's seasonal variations or a lack of variation. There's clothes for each season, and the heating and cooling of homes. So when we talk weather, we aren't talking about climate. We are talking about the atmospheric conditions that affect the climate of a geographic region. We see all of this in play in Avatar. When the series starts off, we are immediately thrust into the Antarctic regions of this world. It's freezing cold, which in the summer, because it's the South Pole, is leaning towards wintertime, while the northern latitudes are actually moving from winter into summer. The typical weather that we see in the poles is sleet and snow with frigid temperatures, whereas in the more moderate climates and the more moderate areas, we see rain, storms, and in a few places, fog. The best example we have of atypical weather is in Season 2 when Team Avatar is flying over the swamp and get grounded by a random tornado that comes out of seemingly nowhere. That's not common weather in a swamp. At best, you might get a hurricane or a typhoon if the swamp is close enough to a coastline that gets those kinds of storms. We also see seasonal variation throughout Avatar as well. In fact, we go through the tail end of winter into spring and into midsummer by the time the series wraps up. We don't really get to see any autumn sequences except for in flashbacks that might take place in that season, but we do see variations, especially in the more moderate climates of the Avatar's world. This brings us to tip number 1. Research the typical and atypical weather and seasonal variations, if any, of a geographic region similar to the kind that you are creating and describing for the world of your story. Where I live here in Central California, we have an interesting range of seasons. There's a common joke where I live that we only have 2 seasons, hot and cold.
So the answer is hot, 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 or cold. Hot, 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 or cold.
Our winters can drop below freezing, and if we get enough rainfall during the fall and winter, we can get really bad tule fog that can last a good portion of the day and makes driving at night incredibly treacherous. Our summers, like it is right now, also get ridiculously hot, where we can see triple-digit heat ranging from 100 to 115 degrees Fahrenheit. When I lived in Japan, I experienced the most frigid winter I've ever encountered and the most miserably humid summer, but the most beautiful spring and autumn that I can ever remember. Ironically enough, Japan sits at roughly the same latitudes as California, but it has far more vibrant seasons, and part of that is because of where it's located. During the winter, Japan gets all this cold air coming down out of Siberia, while sweltering tropical air comes rushing north out of Southeast Asia. The geography and placement of a region affects its weather and changes the seasons, as does the topography. And with the change in seasons, we see how it affects the character's clothing choices. Aang doesn't really change his clothes much between Season 1 and Season 2. He mostly keeps his airbender monk garb in place, whether it's cold or hot, though he does wear more layers when in the North and South Poles. The greatest change in seasonal clothing styles that we see comes from Sokka and Katara, who are wearing really warm, thick fur hides as clothing when they're first introduced, and eventually start trimming back on their clothing as they move into warmer latitudes. By the time Team Avatar reaches the Fire Nation, which is hot, humid, and they're nearing midsummer, they have adopted thinner clothes that breathe a lot better against the heat. We don't really see much in the way of the heating and cooling of homes, with the exception of the warm fires used in the poles or aboard Zuko's ship in Season 1 when they're trying to keep warm against the cold. As for cooling their homes, the easiest way is having a lot of windows, whether fully or partially opened, to direct cross breezes through the houses. So here is tip number 2. Focus on the kinds of ways characters keep themselves warm in winter and cool in summer. Whether it's their use of clothing or lack thereof, or it's the methods that they use to control the climate inside their homes, paying attention to those details helps provide a more tangible existence for the characters and a more tangible experience for the reader. if you describe this well enough, you can get your audience to feel it and not just read it. Moving on to our final category, we're talking about races and species. Now, unless you're writing something in fantasy or science fiction, you probably won't have to deal with species as much. The real world is chock full of examples from people to animals to plant life and so on. But if you are writing something genre specific, Brock provides us with 5 bullet points to help guide us in the creation of something new and different from the norm. Those points include primary and major races or species, minority races and species, dynamics between races and or species, cultural disconnects between races and or species, and commonalities between races and or species. Avatar doesn't really deal with this too much. Most of the dynamics, commonalities, and divides are more culturally and politically generated. But if you look at the different types of bending as racial distinctions, then there is a prejudice that exists within the world of Avatar. When Zuko asked to join the team in Season 3, Sokka is adamantly opposed to it, stating he's a firebender. He's just born bad, which isn't true and is made by someone ignorant to the fact that Zuko has been abused and neglected by his father most of his life. While firebending does come with an innate sense of power and aggression, it also is generated by strong emotion and passion, something Zuko is filled with in equal measure. There is also a distinction between humans and the spirits, which is explored more and becomes more evident during the events of Legend of Korra Season 2. Spirits are not fond of humans, often acting aggressive towards them whenever humans violate some kind of laws of nature or even the spirit world. Case in point, the panda spirit of the forest, Hei Bai, begins abducting villagers in a nearby village because they are destroying the forest to rebuild their homes after the Fire Nation attacks the village. Now, the root cause is an imbalance created by the lack of Aang's presence for the last century, leading to the Fire Nation destroying a lot in their path. But Aang realizes the spirit's immediate need and helps heal the forest, prompting Hei Bai to release the villagers that he abducted. For your story, you're going to need to be just as creative with what you develop. For my series, I deliberately created an interconnectedness between several species because despite the differences, there is more that connects them than they realize. In my books, the world was created by a celestial race called the Kadasur. Members of this race transubstantiated into other life forms to generate life in their own image. The first sentient race or species are dragons created by Drakasar. Orman becomes the first elf and then helps create humans. The elves break into several branches, one of which are called Shadowkin or Blood Elves, and another one breaks into 3 tribes which later become different races in the series themselves. But Asar ends up taking on a human guise, and when he tries to regain his dragon form, the magic corrupts him and he actually becomes the first vampire. And his first offspring, quote unquote, are the Blood Elves. As I mentioned last month when discussing languages, I used closely related languages for these races. I did that deliberately. The dragon tongue is based off of Latin, while the elves are based off of French and Italian, and the vampire language is based off of Castilian Spanish. There were connections threaded throughout their histories, even if they evolve in different directions as people groups. So this brings us to tip 3. Be as creative as you want with the species and races that you develop, but pay attention to employing the bullet points that Brock provides us. Even within the elf branches in my series, there is a disparity between the Maigan elves, which are the true elves, the Algiri or war elves, and the Shadowkin, which are the blood elves. The Maigans were peaceful vegetarians, but they recognized the need for combat and protecting themselves, so the war elves were a branch bred from the more aggressive and violent members of the elf community. The Maigan elves also frowned on the eating of meat, which is why blood elves received their name. They became known as Shadowkin because they preferred to live a nocturnal existence, which helped lead them towards being vampires in the long run. And this brings us to tip number 4. Don't just have dynamic issues between separate races and species, create dynamic situations and issues between branches and members of the same race or species. So that's it for July. Tip 1, research the typical and atypical weather and seasonal variations, if any, of a geographic region similar to the kind you are creating for your world. Tip 2, focus on the kinds of ways characters keep themselves warm in winter and cool in the summer. Tip number 3, be as creative as you want with the species and races that you develop, but pay attention to employing the bullet points Brock provides for us. Tip 4, don't just have dynamic issues between separate races and species, create dynamic situations and issues between branches and members of the same race or species. Follow these tips when developing the weather and races and species of your world building, and you're going to find yourself having an easier time making your literary world far more tangible. Oh, wait. I almost forgot. I have one last writing tip for this video. Tip number 5, make sure you're having fun, because what's the point of writing if you don't enjoy what you're doing? Hey, thanks for watching. Please hit like, hit subscribe, and hit the bell for notifications on new videos. You can support the channel on Patreon and the merch store. Those links can be found down on the video description. And make sure to tune in next week for the Season 5 finale. See you then.